work for a depth of 2, 4, and 8, right? If you do a depth of 3 or 6 or 16, then you're in the depth does not divide evenly into the number of CPUs on a socket, and we want to say -CC none. Here we say -CC NUMA node. It allows them to bounce around but keeps them on the same socket. Here CC none basically says you bounce around anywhere in the node. Dangerous, but running with the depth that does not divide evenly into the number of CPUs in the socket is dangerous in the first place. But this is how you do it. And really, I think of this, and the way it's been explained to me is these shut off binding and make our node behave a little bit more like your classic Linux cluster, because they don't have binding really set on. And this just explains, remember to count the number of CPUs correctly depending on default or J2 mode. If you wanted to get even more advanced and say, well, I want Intel, I want OpenMP threading, and I want binding, then I'm going to say, contact your analysts and get back to us, and we'll make sure you get the right -CC option or something like that. It's possible, or I think it's even possible with this and the right KMP option. But that's deeper than I think many are going to go. Okay, that's great. Then I don't have to do it any deeper than this, because I keep on going, okay, is this slide still right? So this is just a little something thrown in there, single slide on network bandwidth, a reminder that, whoops, I forgot that one. Huh? I forgot to modify it. You can see where the last time I gave this presentation, huh? So, God, it does say Edison in phase 2. Ignore those words, please. Yes, Daint, and get it. Edison is Daint. Hopper would be Rosa. Actually, your Hopper. Anyway, Edison. So the point of this slide really. Oh, geez. Don't tell them. I'm being recorded. Thank you. The point of all of this in any cascade system compared to the XE system is the network bandwidth is going up. The injection bandwidth is going up by a fair amount, and the global bandwidth is going up by quite a bit. And the amount of the global bandwidth is going up. It depends on both how the cascade is configured and the size of the XE system. Our general rule of thumb is the larger the systems that you're comparing, the better that cascade is going to be, because Cascade's global bandwidth actually scales better than the 3D torus in the XE. The thing that will be interesting is, there was a lot of applications that were liked all-to-all, liked to do 3D FFTs, and you guys live next to a fire base. So they like to do 3D FFTs. They like to do all-to-alls. And some of these things, especially as the Gemini systems grew, they were putting that network under pressure, because that network, if you look at it, the wires were the same wires that were in the original Redstorm in 2004 or 5 or whatever. So that has been upgraded, and it will be interesting to see if those really come back into performing a lot better, and if anyone even goes to the point of revisiting those applications a little bit more, those kinds of algorithms, or some applications they tune as to which way they go. So, and in terms of hotspots in the network, also, even if you weren't doing all-to-all, if you were doing a 3D nearest neighbor, if you were doing a 4D nearest neighbor, it was really easy to create hotspots in a Gemini system. Hotspots, adaptive routing really does work, as far as I can tell. It really does work, and I have tried testing it in various, nasty scenarios, and so it does seem to do a good job of preventing hotspots, and so that will be less of a concern. And so there's other. It's not just all-to-all that could see a boost. There's other communication patterns that we're hopeful we'll see a nice boost. Okay. A couple of words on I/O, and I'm not going to give a full I/O tutorial, but this was one that I think is really obvious. This is and worthwhile noting. So we have to do benchmarks where we do MPI/I/O shared file performance. Now, and I'm not an MPI/I/O or shared file expert here, but basically, you have file per process where every single process is writing out its own file, and you have MPI/I/O shared file. The pro of a shared file is you have only one file. It's nicer in terms of the number of files and metadata performance and everything like that. But we'll see performance isn't as good as the performance isn't as good as file per process. So in this case in particular, what this benchmark did, it had a small transfer to and that should be from a larger record. So the transfer size was actually smaller than the record size, and smaller transfer was bad to begin with. Small transfer that was smaller than the record size is doubly bad, and performance was way low. And I will say this is difficult to achieve, and by itself. And difficult to achieve means you got benchmarkers sitting down trying to debate how to even get this performance. Right. My recommendation is to avoid this column and try and have your transfer sizes be larger. Try and have your transfer sizes be the same as the record, and it doesn't have to be a power of 2 to get that performance. But on the other hand, if you're really bandwidth constrained, and if your site allows you to have a larger number of files because you're going to have a file per process, you can get much higher bandwidths out of file per process. You can double, even for these transfer sizes, you can double it again. And we use something called I/O buff for file per process. I'm not going to go into I/O buff. I'm going to just make sure that you guys are aware of it, and you can read the man page on I/O buff, module load I/O buff, and read the man page on I/O buff for a little hint. This is easiest to use when you don't have shared file, when you have file per process. And there's probably something in between a little bit where you don't quite have a file per process. You do a little bit of aggregation yourself, and then you have still a number of unique files. That might be more difficult to do, but you can decide where you want to be on these curves. If bandwidth is really important, maybe file per process is the way to go. If shared file is the advantages of shared file outweigh the file per process, and the bandwidth still is pretty good, that's probably the way to go. So in summary, file per process can benefit from using I/O buff, especially, if you remember this, small transfer sizes, it still gets the same performance because I/O buff is as long as they're contiguous, it's still doing your work for you and turning it into a nice transfer size for the file system. Shared file performance is about 40 to 50% of the file per process performance. most of this is due to the file system locking and semantics. You can actually, I'm not going to go into this here, but you can look at a Cray manual to decide how to help you figure out how to get the most out of MPI-IO, collective buffering, and whatnot. You can also turn on an environment variable to get a bunch of statistics, and it's available with this mpitch, and I got to believe this is available on your system. And then in general, large records with no gaps perform best. Small records with large gaps perform worse, especially on the shared file. So I'm at 1 hour and 20 minutes, and I have about a 15-minute 3D FFT. So if everyone is still okay, I can just do a little 3D FFT case study. This was something that was done originally on Gemini, but I have every reason to believe it's are we good? Okay. I have every reason to believe it's still probably helpful on Cascade, and I don't think we'll have enough time to do this as part of the off-node stuff this afternoon, so I kind of threw it in here. So basically what I had is a little story where a customer had a code whose main computational section was a 3D FFT. It was a 3D FFT, and it was had a 1D decomposition, the original version, which basically means that it had the problem had a series, it was decomposed into a series of planes, and you had 3 compute sections and then 1 communication section. A 3D FFT, not an FFT expert, but basically I always imagine it as compute, transpose, compute, transpose, compute, right? And after that, you get some fancy things about whether or not you reverse the process and everything. But if you have it decomposed into planes, then one of those transposes is just a local memory copy. And one of the transposes is an all-to-all across the machine. The 2 major problems with this implementation is that the real problems that they work on are cubic, and basically they are on the order of the low number of thousands of grid points in any one dimension. And it's difficult to just increase that because time increases with order n cubed. So what they would like to do is they'd like to run faster on a problem that says, say, has a grid of 2,000 squared or 4,000 squared. So they had limited parallelism. With a 1D decomposition, the maximum number of PEs that they could run on was 2,000 or 4,000, maximum 10,000, and really that might just be a toy to run for a relatively few number of time steps. The second problem they had, and this customer was coming from an XT actually with C star, is that as you increase the number of PEs, that all-to-all is still communicating a fixed amount of data. Generally speaking, your message size decreased. And on an XT, the C star, if it had one fault, it was small messages. And so he was not seeing good scaling. Scaling was dropping off as he increased the number of PEs, and then he would run smack dab into a hard limit when he got up to 2,000 or 4,000 on the XT. So he decided. It's just not working anymore. Oh. Let's try this now. So then he decided, before he even got on a Gemini, he decided to implement the 2D decomposition. The new version had 2D decomposition into pencils. You still have the same type of algorithm, compute, transpose, compute, transpose, compute, right? But now, because he had the 2 transposes were both distributed, both were in all-to-alls. They were on all-to-alls over communicators, but they were still all-to-all. And he moved from the XT to the XE, and it was running slower. It was not running the way he would like, and this really means it was running slower. And he was not sure why. He thought with a 2D decomposition, he wasn't going to have this limited parallelism anymore. He was going to have larger messages. Everything should be good. He should be able to scale to 1 million processors. So why was this? Well, reason number one is that he was moving twice as much data as before. Like I said, those two transposes before, one of them was just a local memory copy. Now the other one was actually calling MPI all-to-all, and both of them were picking up the data and setting them down. They were over various communicators, but the way he had it decomposed, it was really just picking it up, throwing out onto the network and setting it back down. So really his communication time doubled. And if anyone's worked with a 3D FFT or an all-to-all, there's a good chance that the all-to-all is the most important part. So doubling the most important part in terms of wall clock time was not the desired behavior. What can we do about this? And what about the decomposition? Well, and then the other thing is, it actually turned out that on Gemini, even with MPI, is much, much, much better at small messages than XT. Aries is also very good at small messages. So the fact that he was seeing poor scaling with small messages on the XT was sort of irrelevant on the XE. And so his 1D decomposition was scaling very well right up until the point he ran out of parallelism. What about this decomposition? Well, the initial decomposition was, they thought, and I actually thought it was reasonable at first too, do it about even, do 100 by 100 or something like that, or maybe 200 by 50. And while the first number in their decomposition represented the logically continuous PEs, which does the first all-to-all. Right, so their communicator was over a logically contiguous 100 PEs, and it would do an all-to-all in that PEs. And when they called this communication section, you would have 100 of these all-to-alls happening simultaneously. The second all-to-all was global bandwidth bound because it was all-to-all over the other dimension. So again, you had 100 simultaneous all-to-alls. Each all-to-all was over a group of PEs with a stride of 100. That, for all intents and purposes, is still like doing a giant all-to-all across the whole machine, and it's global bandwidth bound across the whole machine. It says that this is when I had a slide about all-to-all performance. But what was ended up happening is the first all-to-all still put significant amount of data onto the network. The second all-to-all, there was nothing you could do about it. It was global bandwidth bound. But the first all-to-all, maybe there was something we could do about it. And then it was, what if we reduce the size of the first dimension? Well, if you think about it, as I shrink the size of that first dimension down from 100 to 50 to say 32 or 16, we are keeping a higher and higher percentage of the overall data on node. And it also means, in terms of the way the job is laid out in the network, that a smaller size means fewer, likely closer nodes. So you're keeping a higher percentage of the data on your node, so it doesn't even get injected into the network. And then there's a better chance that those nodes are closer, which helps in the XE, and it's still a good idea on the cascade. So this, he was moving to a Magni-Core at this time. So we ended up trying a 24 by M decomposition. And the magic number is 24 because the communication of the first all-to-all fits entirely on node. With Magni-Cores, you had 24 ranks per node. So having a decomposition of 24 meant, oh, all of a sudden that all-to-all, yes, I was calling MPI, but it was all on node. It wasn't even being injected into the network. There was no competition for the network. And essentially, the time associated with the first all-to-all disappeared. Poof, went away. And he was back to the point of, in terms of time, only the second one taking a significant of time. The second thing is that when he was running, he had a 2D decomposition, and yes, he thought, oh, this will scale to 1,000,000 cores. Okay, you're scaling to 1,000,000 cores, but you were only testing on 1,024, right? And I mean, that's how he ran most of it. And really, well, in this case, he was just getting to less than 4,000 cores. And it turns out that he did all this work because he thought he had to do it to performance, and then it would performance even at low core counts, and it would help at high core counts. Really, what happened is the 1D version was performing just fine on Gemini, and the 1D version would probably perform just fine on Cascade. So if you're doing a 3D decomposition and or 3D FFT, and you're running on 1,000 nodes or something like that, and you haven't run out of parallelism, stick with it. You know, it could perform just as well or even better than a 2D version. The 2D version was really designed to run on more cores. So make sure if you're going to do a 2D version that you run it on this many cores, or really give some thought into how the decomposition works. And I think that's sort of a moral of the story. That was something that we, you know, I believe this has kind of been discovered independently by a couple of people, but the other people that I saw did this didn't go into, like, they just discovered that this decomposition was the best and ran with it and never put in thought or explained why. And this was the explanation why. And it should still be same on Cascade, because while the network is fast, on node is faster. So keep that in mind. And that's the end of the general tips and trips. You can see it was kind of like take something from here, take something from there, but it should hopefully hit a few things that are of interest to you. Any questions about anything? Bandwidth is going up by a fair amount, and the global bandwidth is going up by quite a bit. And the amount of the global bandwidth is going up, it depends on both how the Cascade is configured and the size of the XE system. Our general rule of thumb is the larger the systems that you're comparing, the better that Cascade is going to be, because Cascade's global bandwidth actually scales better than the 3D torus in the XE. The thing that will be interesting is, you know, there was a lot of applications that were liked all-to-all, liked to do 3D FFTs, and you guys live next to a fire base. So they like to do work for a depth of 2, 4, and 8, right? If you do a depth of 3 or 6 or 16, then you're in the depth does not divide evenly into the number of CPUs on a socket, and we want to say -CC none. Here we say -CC NUMA node. It allows them to bounce around but keeps them on the same socket. Here CC none basically says you bounce around anywhere in the node. Dangerous, but running with the depth that does not divide evenly into the number of CPUs in the socket is dangerous in the first place. But this is how you do it. And really, I think of this, and the way it's been explained to me is these shut off binding and make our node behave a little bit more like your classic Linux cluster, because they don't have binding really set on. And this just explains, remember to count the number of CPUs correctly, depending on default or J2 mode. If you wanted to get even more advanced and say, well, I want Intel, I want OpenMP threading, and I want binding, then I'm going to say, you know, contact your analysts and get back to us, and we'll make sure you get the right -CC option or something like that. It's possible. Or I think it's even possible with this and the right KMP option. But that's deeper than I think many are going to go. Okay, that's great. Then I don't have to do it any deeper than this because I keep on going, okay, is this slide still right? So this is just a little something thrown in there, single slide on network bandwidth, a reminder that, whoops, I forgot that one. Huh? I forgot to modify it. You can see whereas the last time I gave this presentation, huh? So, God, it does say Edison in phase 2. Ignore those words, please. Yes, Daint, and well, get it. Edison is Daint. Hopper would be Rosa. Actually, your Hopper. Anyway, so Edison. So the point of this slide really. Oh, geez. Don't tell them. I'm being recorded. Thank you. The point of all of this in any cascade system compared to the XE system is the network bandwidth is going up. The injection